text came through garbled. The number she'd written was $41,000, and it was for a wheelchair my brother supposedly couldn't walk without. I read it twice on the bench outside the pharmacy, my reading glasses fogging in the cold, before I understood what I was looking at. My nephew had forwarded it to me by mistake, I think. Or maybe not by mistake at all. Maybe some part of him wanted somebody to see it. Either way, there it was on my phone, a screenshot of a message from his wife to her sister, and in it she was already spending money my brother Dale hadn't died to leave yet. I should back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who Dale was to me. We grew up outside Lincoln, Nebraska. Two boys sharing a bedroom barely big enough for the bunk beds our father built out of scrap lumber. Dale was younger by 3 years and slower by every measure that school teachers care about. But he had a way with engines that I never had with anything. By the time he was 16, he could take apart a carburetor blind and put it back together better than it came from the factory. He opened his own shop the year I left for the army, and he ran it for 40 years, Hartwell and Son, even though the son in question, his boy Cody, never showed the slightest interest in turning a wrench. I'm 71 now. Dale passed this last March, and I'll get to that. But first I need you to know I never once worried about my brother's money while he was alive, because Dale didn't have the kind of money worth worrying over. He had the shop, a paid-off house on a half-acre, and a stubborn refusal to retire that drove his doctors crazy. What he had that mattered was a granddaughter named Sophie, 11 years old, who could sit on a stool in that greasy shop for 6 hours straight, just watching him work, asking questions, handing him sockets before he asked for them. She was the son he'd been waiting for, 60 years late and wearing pigtails, and the two of them adored each other in a way that made my own old heart ache pleasantly every time I saw it. Before I tell you what they did to him, do me a favor and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you got people in your life you'd walk through fire for, hit that subscribe button, because this is a story about exactly that and about what it costs. The trouble had a name, and the name was Vanessa. She married Cody about 9 years back, and from the first Thanksgiving she sat at our table, I felt that low hum a man learns to trust after enough decades, the feeling you get standing near a power line that isn't quite right, nothing you could point at. She was pretty, and she laughed at the right moments, and she always complimented Dale's cooking, but her eyes were always doing arithmetic. I'd watch her take in a room, the furniture, the watch on your wrist, the make of your car in the driveway, and you could practically hear the cash register ringing behind her smile. Cody, God help him, never saw it. My nephew was a sweet, soft, agreeable man who'd spent his whole life being told what to do, first by his mother, then by Vanessa, and he did it gladly because it was easier than thinking. He sold insurance. He was good at it in the way that pleasant men are good at things that require people to like them, and he made a decent living, but Vanessa spent it faster than he made it. New kitchen 1 year, a boat the next, used twice, a trip to Cancun. They put on 3 different credit cards. So when Dale's health started slipping 2 winters ago, I watched Vanessa the way you watch a dog near a baby, politely, constantly. It started with the diagnosis. Dale's heart, the doctor said, was wearing out, decades of cigarettes and grease and skipped checkups finally presenting the bill. He needed surgery, and then he needed more surgery, and somewhere in there he couldn't run the shop alone anymore, and that's when Vanessa appeared at his side like she'd been waiting in the wings her whole life. Suddenly, she was the devoted granddaughter-in-law. She drove him to appointments. She organized his pills into one of those plastic days of the week trays. She sat in on meetings with his doctors and his accountant, taking notes, asking about costs, always about costs. And to a tired, frightened old man who lost his wife to cancer 15 years back and had nobody else stepping up, she must have looked like an angel. I tried to be there. I lived 2 hours away in Omaha, and I made the drive every week, sometimes twice. But I had my own slowing down to manage, a bad hip, and a license my own doctor was starting to give me looks about. Vanessa was right there in town, 10 minutes from Dale's house. Proximity is its own kind of power. The first thing that struck me wrong was the will. We were sitting in Dale's kitchen, the three of us, Dale and Vanessa and me, after one of his cardiology appointments. Cody was at work, Sophie was at school, and Vanessa, stirring sugar into Dale's coffee that he wasn't supposed to have, said, light as anything, Dale, you really ought to get your affairs in order. For Sophie's sake. You don't want the state taking half of it in probate, do you? I know a fellow who can set up a trust, make it all clean. Now, Dale had a will. He'd had one for years, drawn up by the same lawyer who'd handled his divorce and his wife's estate, a sharp old bird named Margaret who'd known the family since before Cody was born. I knew the broad strokes of it because Dale had told me himself more than once over beers on his back porch. The house and his savings, modest as they were, went into a trust for Sophie's education and care, with Cody as trustee until she came of age. The shop and its land, which were worth more than everything else combined because a developer had been sniffing around that corner lot for years, went the same way. It was a good plan, a grandfather's plan. I've got it handled, Nessa, Dale said. With all due respect, she said, and I have never in my life heard that phrase precede anything respectful. That old lawyer of yours probably set things up the way they did things 20 years ago. Things change. There are tax implications. I just want what's best for the family. For the family. She said it the way a card sharp says, trust me, I should have spoken up right then. I want you to understand that the rest of this story is, in part, a story about my own silence, about all the moments I told myself it wasn't my place, that Dale was a grown man, that I'd be overstepping. I sat at that table and I drank my coffee, and I said nothing, and I have thought about that a great deal since. Over the next few months, the changes came one at a time, each small enough on its own to explain away. Margaret the lawyer stopped being mentioned. There was a new attorney now, somebody Vanessa knew, a young man with a downtown office and a firm handshake. Dale's accountant of 30 years, a quiet man named Pete, got replaced with a financial advisor Vanessa described as much more proactive. Dale's mail started going to Cody and Vanessa's house, so things don't pile up while he's in and out of the hospital. His online banking passwords ended up on a sticky note on Vanessa's refrigerator. I learned later, in case of emergency. And little by little, my brother's world narrowed until the only door out of it led through his granddaughter-in-law. The shop closed that summer. Dale was too sick to run it, and there was nobody to take it over, so the equipment got sold off and the building sat empty with a for sale sign in the window. I asked Dale once what was happening with the land, with the developer, and he got a confused look on his face and said Vanessa was handling it, that there was paperwork, that it was complicated. He'd always been able to rebuild the transmission from memory. Now he couldn't tell me he owned his own building. That should have been my alarm bell. Instead, I told myself he was just tired. Sick men get confused. I drove home to Omaha that night and I didn't think about it again for 2 weeks. And I will carry that. The thing that finally cracked it open was Sophie. It was a Sunday in February, raw and grey, and I'd driven up to sit with Dale for the afternoon. He was in his recliner with a quilt over his legs, dozing more than talking, and Sophie was on the floor doing homework. Cody had dropped her off. He and Vanessa were running errands, which by then I'd learned to translate. Sophie was quiet that day, which wasn't like her. I got down on the floor with her, my hips screaming the whole way, and asked what was wrong. She didn't want to say. I waited. Kids will tell you things if you just shut up and wait. I learned that raising 2 of my own. Finally, she said, not looking at me. Aunt Vanessa says when Grandpa goes to heaven, we're gonna sell his house and the shop and use the money for a better life. She says I shouldn't get too attached to his stuff because it's all gonna get sold. I kept my voice even. That took everything I had. She said that to you? Sophie nodded. She said I should pick one thing now to remember him by, before it all goes. I picked his old wrench, the red one. She finally looked up at me, and her eyes were wet. Uncle Ray, is Grandpa gonna die? I pulled that child into my arms and I told her the truth, which was that her grandpa was very sick and we didn't know how much time was left, but that she should spend every minute with him she could, because love doesn't get sold off. And over the top of her head, I stared at the wall and I felt something in me go cold and quiet and certain. That woman had looked at a dying man's grandchild and started liquidating the inheritance out loud, in front of her, like reading off a grocery list, picking out which feelings the kid was allowed to keep. That was the day I stopped being a polite old man 2 hours away. That was the day I became something else. I didn't say a word to anyone. That was the first thing I understood, sitting in my truck in Dale's driveway that night with the heater running and my hand shaking, not from the cold. If I confronted Vanessa, she'd close ranks. She'd limit my access to Dale, frame me as a bitter old man causing stress to a dying patient, and Cody would back her because Cody always backed her. I'd seen how thoroughly she'd walled my brother off. I had to assume she could do the same to me, and faster. So I did the hardest thing a worried man can do. I got patient. The next morning I called Margaret, Dale's old lawyer. I half expected her to be retired or gone, but she answered her own phone on the second ring, same as ever. And when I told her who I was, there was a long pause. "Raymond," she said. "I wondered if anybody in that family would ever call me." She couldn't tell me much. I wasn't her client, Dale was. But she told me one thing that mattered. About 14 months earlier, Dale had come into our office with Vanessa, and the two of them had asked her to make changes to the trust, and Margaret had refused. She'd refused because, in her professional judgment, Dale hadn't seemed to fully understand what he was being asked to sign, and because the changes Vanessa was pushing for moved control of the assets away from a trust for Sophie and toward Cody and Vanessa directly. Margaret had asked to speak to Dale alone. Vanessa had refused to leave the room. Margaret had declined the work and, in her words, they did not come back. I made a note in the file, she told me. "I always do when something smells. Your brother was not himself, Raymond, and that woman did not want him to be alone with me for 30 seconds. You draw your own conclusions." I drew them. Here's what I figured out over the following weeks, and I'll spare you the tedium of how, because it involved a great deal of driving and a great deal of pretending to be a doddering old uncle who just wanted to visit, which turned out to be the most useful disguise of my life. Nobody guards their words around a sweet, harmless old man who keeps losing his train of thought. I lost a great many trains of thought that spring, on purpose, and people told me things. The new lawyer had drawn up new documents. They hadn't been able to change the trust the way they wanted, while Margaret's note sat in a file somewhere, so they'd gone a different route. Power of attorney. Vanessa had gotten herself named as Dale's financial power of attorney for his convenience, and with it she'd been doing exactly what you'd expect. The shop land had been sold to the developer, all right, for a sum that made my eyes water when I finally saw it, and the money had not gone into any trust for Sophie. It had gone into accounts Vanessa controlled. The $41,000 wheelchair was one line item among many, padding and skimming, a dying man's estate being bled out, a withdrawal at a time while everyone called it caregiving. And the wheelchair, the actual physical wheelchair, the one she'd billed $41,000 against? I went to see it. Dale did have one now, a basic folding model, the kind you can buy for $200 at a medical supply store. It sat in the corner of his bedroom, mostly unused, because by then he could still shuffle to the bathroom on his own. $200 of chair, $41,000 of lie. But here is the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing that tells you everything about who Vanessa was. With all that money flowing, with the shop sold for what it sold for, my brother spent his last winter cold. His furnace was old, original to the house, and it had started cutting out. I noticed it the way you notice anything when you're paying attention finally, which is to say all at once. The house was chilly, the way a house gets when somebody's afraid of the heating bill. Dale had a space heater by his recliner and another by his bed, and he kept a quilt over his legs even at midday. And when I asked him about the furnace, he said Vanessa was getting quotes, that the repair guy was expensive, that they had to be careful with money now. Careful with money. A man whose corner lot had just sold for the price of a nice house, sitting in a cold room being told to be careful with money so his granddaughter-in-law could be careful with it instead. At a jeweler, at a dealership, on a sister in Phoenix who I later learned got a loan of $12,000 that everyone knew would never be paid back. My brother, who'd kept half of Lincoln's cars running for 40 years, who'd never once been late on a bill in his life, was being made to feel like a burden in his own paid-off house. And he believed it. That's the part that still wakes me up some nights. They'd convinced him he was a drain, that he should be grateful, that the code was just how things had to be. I bought him a new furnace. I want to be clear that I didn't do it as a strategy. I did it because my baby brother was cold and I had $11,000 in a savings account, and there was not one single thing in this world I'd rather have spent it on. I called a company out of Omaha, not Lincoln, so word wouldn't get back, and I had them install it on a Tuesday when I knew Vanessa was getting her nails done. A standing appointment. I'd noted the way I now noted everything. Dale cried when the warm air came up through the vents. A grown man, my big tough little brother, sat in his recliner and cried because his house was warm and told me Vanessa had said they couldn't afford it. I held his hand and I told him we could afford anything we needed to, that he was not a burden, that he had never once in his life been a burden to me, and I made him a promise I didn't explain. I told him I was going to make sure Sophie was taken care of. He squeezed my hand and said he knew I would, and I think some part of him understood more than he let on, because he looked at me a long moment and said, "Ray, I'm not as far gone as they think I am. I just got tired of fighting her." "You don't have to fight her," I said. "I'll do that part." He died 11 days later, in his sleep, warm, which is the one mercy in all of this. I got the call at 4 in the morning, and I drove the 2 hours in the dark, and I made the funeral arrangements myself because Vanessa was, and I quote, too devastated to handle the details. She found the strength to handle the details 3 days after the funeral when she called the new lawyer. The reading of the will, such as it was, happened in that downtown office with the firm handshake. Cody was there, gray and hollow, finally looking like a man who'd lost someone. Vanessa sat beside him in black that still managed to look expensive. Sophie wasn't there. She was at school, which I'd insisted on. No 11-year-old needs to sit through that. And I was there because I'd called the lawyer myself and informed him very politely in my doddering way that I was Dale's brother and his executor. That stopped the room, because here is what Vanessa hadn't counted on. The one card I'd been holding since that first phone call. Margaret had refused to change the trust. The power of attorney Vanessa held died the instant Dale did. A POA only works while a person is alive. The will that governed everything after his death was the old will, the good one, Margaret's will, the grandfather's plan, naming me, Raymond Hartwell, as executor of the estate and the trust for Sophie. The new lawyer's new documents had handled the money flowing during Dale's life. They had never managed to touch what happened after. I had spent the spring being underestimated, and I had used every minute of it to make sure the one document that mattered was still standing. The new lawyer cleared his throat and started explaining how things had been restructured, and I let him talk for a while because I wanted Vanessa to relax. Then I set a folder on the table. In it was Margaret's original trust, properly filed. A letter from Margaret, documenting the day she'd refused to make changes and why. Bank records, which as the named executor I now had every right to demand, showing where the shop money had actually gone. The $41,000 wheelchair, the $12,000 loan to Phoenix, the cold house and the warm house, line by line. And one more thing, a photograph Sophie had taken on her own little phone months back that she'd shown me without understanding what it was. Vanessa in the empty shop, the day the equipment was being hauled away, standing next to a man none of us knew, the developer's representative, the two of them shaking hands and laughing, a check visible in the man's other hand. Sophie had taken it because she'd wanted a picture of Grandpa's shop one last time, and Vanessa had wandered into frame. A child's keepsake and a smoking gun. I slid it across the table last. I won't pretend it played out like a movie, with a confession and a collapse. It played out like real things do, slow and ugly and through lawyers. But I watched Vanessa's face while she looked at that folder, and I watched the exact moment she understood that the harmless old uncle had been counting too. That the trains of thought I kept losing had all arrived exactly on schedule, at the station I'd chosen. The estate went to Sophie's trust, where it had always been meant to go. Every dollar that could be recovered, and a good deal could be, because Vanessa had been sloppy the way people get when they think no one's watching. The money she'd already spent, the lawyers handled. There were words like fraud, and undue influence, and breach of fiduciary duty. And Margaret, who came out of semi-retirement for the pleasure of it, used all of them with great relish. Cody, I'll tell you, surprised me. When he saw it all laid out, when he understood what had been done to his father in his own name, something in him that had been asleep for 40 years finally woke up. He didn't defend her. He looked at that photograph of his wife laughing over a check while his dad sat cool 2 miles away, and he stood up from that table and walked out. And he didn't go home to her. They divorced before the year was out. He's got Sophie most of the time now, and he brings her to see me. And the boy I'd written off as hopeless turned out to have his father's spine after all, just buried deep and late in coming. Sophie's college is paid for. The trust will see to that, and to a good deal more, exactly as her grandfather intended. She kept the red wrench. She keeps it on her desk, and last time I visited, she told me she wants to learn to fix cars. Real ones. And I told her grandpa would have liked nothing in this world better, and we both cried a little. The good kind. I think about silence a lot now. About all those months I sat at that kitchen table telling myself it wasn't my place. I came so close to being too late. If Sophie hadn't said what she said, if Margaret hadn't made her note, if I'd kept being polite one more season, that woman would have walked off with a dead man's life's work and a little girl's future and called it grief. So if you take one thing from an old man who learned it the hard way, take this. The people who'd bleed your family dry don't always come in like villains. They come in carrying pill organizers and quotes for furnace repairs they never intend to make. They come in saying for the family, watch the ones who say it most. And if that low hum ever starts up near someone you love, the feeling that something isn't right, don't you dare be polite about it the way I was. Polite is what they're counting on. I keep the Red Wrench's twin on my own desk now. Dave gave me a matching 1 year ago, a joke between us, and I never had any use for it, being all thumbs with engines my whole life. I got a use for it now. It reminds me that being underestimated is the sharpest tool a man can carry if he's patient enough to wait for the right moment to use it. And it reminds me of my brother, warm at the last, which is the only ending to this I can stand to keep. The thing that haunts me isn't what Vanessa did. People like her have always existed and always will. What haunts me is how close I came to letting it happen, sitting at Dale's kitchen table month after month, telling myself it wasn't my business. I want you to understand that silence has a price, and somebody you love is usually the one who pays it. Look at how it all unspooled. Vanessa didn't take my brother in one bold move. She took him an inch at a time, a new lawyer here, a forwarded piece of mail there, a password on a sticky note, until the only road out of his own life ran straight through her. Every small thing I excused added up to a cold house and a $41,000 lie. That's how these things work. Nobody loses everything in a day. They lose it in all the days they told themselves it wasn't time to act yet. But notice what undid her, because that part matters more. It wasn't rage. The day I found Sophie crying on that floor, I wanted to drive straight over it and put my fist through a wall, and if I had, Vanessa would have won. She'd have called me a bitter old man stressing a dying patient and locked me out for good. What beat her was 3 things working together. The first was simply refusing to look away from a wrong once I'd seen it clearly, deciding that a frightened 11-year-old and a cold, frightened man were worth more than my comfort. The second was thinking instead of reacting, getting patient, calling Margaret, letting people talk to a harmless old uncle who kept losing his train of thought. And the third was the plain stubbornness to keep driving those 2 hours, keep counting, keep waiting for the right moment instead of the loud one. Goodness without cleverness would have left me yelling on a porch while she emptied the accounts. Cleverness without goodness is just what Vanessa had. And neither one survives without the grit to see it all the way through when you're 71 with a bad hip and every reason to quit. You need all three, working together, or you don't make it to the folder on the table. So here's what I'd ask of you. If a tired old man can ask anything, when that low hum starts up near somebody you love, the feeling that something just isn't right, don't be polite about it the way I almost was. Let it bother you. Then be smart about it, quiet and patient, because the loud, satisfying move is almost always the wrong one. And then don't stop. Underestimation is a gift if you got the spine to use it. Sophie keeps the red wrench on her desk. I keep its twin on mine. Dale died warm, in his sleep. And I have to believe some part of him knew his brother was finally fighting the fight he'd gotten too tired to fight himself. That's the only ending I can carry, and I carry it on purpose.